Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome. Welcome to all of you here in person and those of you attending online to our public roundtable on refusing carcerality. I will be tonight's chair. I'm Jenna Marshall. I'm a lecturer here in International Studies in the Department of European and International Studies. And it is a privilege to bring together tonight's diverse panel of speakers, each offering unique insights on tonight's topic. So before we dive into the discussion, I would like to just give a brief outline for tonight's event. We will begin with open interventions, where each speaker is designated roughly 5 to 7 minutes to deliver their understanding of carcerality as they currently perceive it and explore the ways in which we can refuse these carceral systems. Following these opening interventions, we will then move on to a roundtable discussion, and this exchange will last roughly 20 to 25 minutes. And then as we approach the final segment, we will open the floor to the audience here in person and online as an opportunity for you to pose any questions to tonight's panelists. And this segment will run for roughly 30 minutes. For our online audience, we encourage you to utilize the chat or comment feature to submit any questions, which will then be relayed to myself. And yeah, we look forward to your active involvement in tonight's discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce tonight's panelists. First, we have Shanice Octavia McBean, is a London-based writer and activist, and a self-described revolutionary and Afro-Marxist. Shanice is also the co-author with Avia Saraday of Abolition Revolution, published with Pluto Press. We also have Stuart Schrader. He is Associate Research Professor of Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University and Associate Director of the Program in Race, Immigration, and Citizenship. He's author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, and this is published with University of California Press. We also have joining us my colleague, Rafif Ziada. She is lecturer in politics and public policy in the Department of International Development here at King's College London, and she is co-author with Brina Bandar of the volume Revolutionary Feminisms, Conversations on Collective Action and Radical Thought. We also have joining us is Adam Elliott Cooper. He is a lecturer in public and social policy at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author of Black Resistance to British Policing, published with Manchester University Press, as well as co-author of Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State, and that's with Pluto Press. And rounding out our panel for tonight is Aaron Winter. He is a senior lecturer in sociology with a focus on race and anti-racism at Lancaster University. He is co-author with Aurelian Maudin of Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. And this is published with Verso Press. And he's also co-editor of the book series Racism, Resistance, and Social Change. So that was a mouthful, but I will now hand over to Shanice to begin her 5 to 7 minute intervention.
Thank you very much. So my head is really preoccupied because I'm halfway through a 28-day strike, and literally right now there is a really important members meeting happening where we're voting about what's going to happen next. But I thought it would be useful to use that as a theme and an entryway into talking about carcerality. And so I'm in the charity sector. We're in a dispute around pay, but it's not the first time that my organisation and my shop has been on strike. We had a huge strike in 2014 and won. But what's quite interesting about that first strike was in fact the use of police to intimidate strikers on the picket line, and the use of police to kind of present this image of the wayward, violent striker slash worker slash picket. And I'm pleased to say that that hasn't happened this time round in our dispute. But for example, if you look at the more recent dispute at Great Ormond Street Hospital with, security staff and cleaning staff, very low paid, people who are considered unskilled, but actually when it comes to patient care, often do some of the most important work with supporting people. And you find that in homelessness as well. What we call night workers, the people who are paid the least, often end up doing some of the hardest jobs when it comes to looking after our client group. But anyway, the point of bringing them up is that they were in dispute. They're a workforce that's mostly kind of Black, Asian, migrant, recently migrated workers, and their management team in fact used the courts to take out an injunction using and leaning on recent legislation like the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act to take an injunction against their pickets on the basis that their pickets were too loud and noisy and disruptive, which by the way is exactly what a picket is supposed to be. And we're seeing more and more of this through the use of the new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which for those of you who were around and active in 2021 will know that there was a significant movement that was sparked after the murder of Sarah Everard called the Kill the Bill movement that tried to fight that legislation. And I think that the use of that legislation against striking workers, against pickets particularly, but the right to protest more generally, I think points to the deep use of carcerality and the need for carcerality from the perspective of the state. And I guess as well in the Great Ormond Street dispute, you also see that connection between race and class, the use of recently migrated workers and pinning them as kind of folk devils, these people coming in, causing trouble to our poor patients, the poor children that need our care. And that's the kind of narrative that was pushed around them and that justified the use of police and then following the court system to intervene in that dispute. But I think when it comes to looking at the workplace, when it comes to looking at capitalism and productivity in the workplace and its connection to carcerality, I'm really struck by Chris Smalls, who you might know from the Amazon Labour Union. He was in the UK recently, and he told a really harrowing story about the conditions in Amazon warehouses that was then backed up by some of the workers in the UK that we heard from in that meeting as well. We're really talking about these Amazon warehouses being essentially places where undesirable working class people are warehoused, shut away in private, much like, and that you might consider this to be a bit of a metaphor, but actually much like the way in which prisons is used. And particularly if you look at the rise of and the growth of the prison system in the UK, particularly during that kind of dawn of neoliberalism, we are quite literally talking about the state using these buildings to warehouse undesirable working class people for whom they wanted to retract state funding and state support from. And you see at that period the explosion, almost a kind of Victorian-esque explosion of prisons that's continued on into today. And in fact, just to give you a little kind of, representation of how bad the problem is, I don't remember the exact date, but the Ministry of Justice said that by 2026, the prison population in the UK will increase by 24%, not because there is an increase in crime, but because there's going to be an increase in the numbers of police and use of police in order to essentially capture people and put them in these buildings. So again, you see that warehousing of working class life. But with Amazon, we're really talking about mass sites of working class cleansing. We're talking about conditions where people are having to. Chris Smalls talked about people having to piss in bottles because they can't take breaks. For example, people being laid off because they've got kidney failure, people being sacked en masse because they dare to try to get a union recognized, and people, working overtime without getting paid, and, numbers mysteriously disappearing from timesheets. These are conditions that approximate and get very, very close to slave labor. And in many ways, these are the conditions that we see in UK prisons as well. So, for example, the average prisoner in the UK earns about £9 a week. The minimum that they're allowed to get paid is £4 a week. So we're really talking really high conditions of what, from a Marxist perspective, you would call hyper-exploitation, but from a moral perspective, it's just disgusting. And these are allowed to take place because we've created, through the use and concept of carcerality and punishment and desirable and undesirable human beings, literal buildings where dehumanization can take place. But that has now spilled out of the typical places where carcerality takes place, the jail cell, the prison cell, and has now also moved into the workforce and indeed the picket line. And in many ways, carcerality in this instance is being used to prepare people to be productive and to prepare people for the dehumanization that often comes with productivity under capitalism. So you go to work and you're productive for your boss, but you're not only productive, you're also treated like shit. And places like where Amazon warehouses and prisons are sites where people are prepared for that. But you also find that in schools as well. Carcerality in schools is very much about preparing people for hierarchy, preparing people to be voiceless, preparing people to behave, and if you don't behave, you'll get punished. So you can see the way in which that kind of expectations of regulated behavior happen from the school to the prison to the workplace as well. All the reason for this is to protect capital, of course, and to make us more productive. But not just to protect capital and make us more productive, but particularly with the use of police on the picket lines, it's about literally protecting exploiters, bosses, from the insurrectionary power of workers. So very briefly, I know I'm probably going over time, but very briefly, I wanted to draw your attention to the origins of the Metropolitan Police, which were the first state-funded police institution in the world. And there's this kind of almost scenic, television-esque mythology about the idea, police formed in order to protect the working man from crime and harm, and it's nonsense. So in fact what happened is in the early 1800s there are experimentations with policing on London's docks, and the point of that was to protect the supplies and the produce from being stolen by the workers. The workers were taking that extra produce to bolster their pitiful wages. And so there was experiments with a private police force to make sure that workers didn't pick from the produce. Then there was waves of strikes, there was direct action, the government tried to ban strikes, it didn't work, people just, they destroyed factory equipment, there was mass protest in 1819, you get the Peterloo Massacre, which was a result of using lethal force against a protest. Instead of quelling that protest, people became more angry, there were more mass demonstrations. This is a very short version of the story. Oh, that's gone off. It's a very shortened version of the story, but essentially, there was a fear of revolution, and by 1829, the state finally, after Robert Peel made several attempts, the state finally agreed to a state-funded policing service, not to protect the ordinary man from harm, but to protect the bourgeoisie from the insurrectionary power of the ordinary working person. And so from the very beginning, carcerality and productivity and exploitation are connected. And with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, the hypercriminalization of protest and of pickets and of striking, the narrowing of the right to strike, you can see how that function of carcerality moves into today. So I'll end just by saying, in order to refuse carcerality, we have to continue to push back. That means breaking sometimes, the letter of a legislation. If the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act is telling us we can't have noisy protests, then it becomes incumbent upon us to have noisy protests and to have noisy pickets. And I think, continuing to fight that dehumanization in places like Amazon warehouses and prisons is part of how we can begin to refuse carcerality.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you, Jenna and Sherry, for bringing me to London to be with all of you tonight, and thank you for being here. So I want to build on what we just heard and make what hopefully is just a very simple but useful argument, which is that for movements against police abuse, against violence, against repression, movements that want to refuse carcerality, to use our term, for them to be effective, they need to be linked to anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-migration movements. They need to be internationalist. The struggle to defeat or weaken carcerality on our blocks, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, must be linked to the struggle to end state violence far away, at border crossings, in distant countries on other continents. And the reason for this, as I've argued throughout my work in my book, Badges Without Borders, is that police themselves have always imagined the problems they face, the threats they're up against, the enemy they want to control or neutralize, as more than local, as always in motion, as crossing borders, as international. So for that reason, whether in the UK or the United States or other places, police travel, police are linked with the military. They've been essential to colonial operations of warfare, of counterinsurgency across the centuries. Policing practices travel, they replicate, they link forms of repression across distances. So I want to provide you with maybe 3 ways to think about this so that you can kind of take a look at what's going on in your own place where you're working and thinking and engaging in activism to try to think about these types of connections between police and military, between war fighting and crime fighting. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Baltimore, where I live now. Some of you may have seen the television show The Wire. It's a little bit different. The police are not the heroes of my story. So the 3 registers or dimensions of policing that connect foreign and domestic operations that I would talk about are personnel, technology, and operational tactics. Each of these, I think, shows imperial entanglements for policing in the past and in the present. So let's talk about personnel. This is probably the most easy to understand, the most obvious. Police officers travel, usually for 3 reasons: to engage in training of colleagues in other places, to upgrade the kind of technical capacity or competency of those colleagues, introducing new routines, new ideas, and perhaps most importantly, to construct a more than local or even global kind of fellowship or brotherhood, that's the term they would use, that cements kind of interpersonal and ideological links across borders. So some of the most famous police officials in history, including Peel, are ones who've traveled across borders to share their ideas. But of course, ideas need material underpinnings to travel, as well as material infrastructure. So police build those. They build schools to train people in other places. They write textbooks and they translate their textbooks. So it's important to pay attention to who's writing the textbooks and where they're sending them. But even the people who don't get their names in the books, the nameless, low-ranking officers, they also travel. Whether it's recruitment of police in metropolitan areas from colonial areas, this is common. In Baltimore, police are recruited from places like Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. colony. They're promised better pay and working conditions if they would move to Baltimore. But also, of course, police go on junkets traveling to other places, learning about similarities and differences in weaponry, in the kind of structure or provision of rights or lack thereof. They learn about different departmental cultures. And the justification for these types of travel are always, is always framed as improving things, reforming things, modernizing. But I think we need to be skeptical of those claims. But I also want to mention that we don't need to assume that somebody needs to travel across borders to learn how to be racist. Of course, police can learn how to be racist without ever going abroad. Instead, the reason to highlight these types of travels is that they help us to crystallize the shared conditions across borders of different places, and I think that can be the basis of solidarity for movements. So let me quickly turn to technology with another set of examples from Baltimore. The city has seen a number of experiments with aerial police surveillance lately in the past decade or so. In 2015, as some of you may know, there was an uprising in Baltimore after the police killed Freddie Gray, and a mysterious single-engine airplane started flying over the city, and it turned out it was being operated by the FBI, by the federal government, but the FBI went to great lengths to hide that fact. It used shell companies and other kind of masking techniques. And the technology that it was using was something called a dirt box, which basically sucks up the cell phone data of everybody that was flying over. Everybody in the streets in the city was getting their data sucked up. So the FBI operation got revealed. They denied what they were doing, but of course that wasn't true. They said it was within the bounds of the Constitution, also not true. But they put an end to it. And then all of a sudden a new plane emerged. A new plane started flying over Baltimore. And this one, instead of being operated by the FBI, was operated by a private company. And so this is another thing to pay attention to, is the use of private firms in all of this. So this private company was actually funded by a philanthropist, a billionaire who had the best interests of everybody at heart. Of course, he's interested in criminal justice reform, but he didn't tell the mayor, he didn't tell the city council, he didn't, of course, tell the residents of the city that there was going to be a plane flying over their heads and making a video of them. And so the video surveillance company was called Persistent Surveillance Systems. And the technology it operated was originally called Constant Hawk, and it was used in Iraq and Afghanistan before it was used in Baltimore. And it's pretty interesting what it could do. It makes a single seamless image of the whole city over a span of time. And so the police, if they want to find an incident that happens over, say, a 6-hour period, they can basically rewind reality and watch the whole thing unfold. And they can see where people who are nearby, where they came from, follow them back home. And so basically, if you're in the vicinity, you might be recorded without being, you might hear the plane overhead, but you don't know you're being recorded, and they can trace every step, every move you make. And of course, this was invented to respond to guerrilla warfare. And it was I have to say, it was very jarring to hear this plane constantly flying overhead. And this is something that people refer to about constant surveillance by drones in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, how jarring it is to hear the sound of somebody surveilling your every move. So this is a technology of war boomeranging home. And again, it's not to say that what's made for war should stay overseas in the theater of war, but instead to build solidarity between people who are under surveillance in war zones as well as at home. So finally, to continue on the lines of countering guerrilla warfare, or supposedly, I want to talk about police operations. So we often will talk about police militarization in terms of these types of technologies, but we can also think about police tactics in the same way. So again, in Baltimore, after the uprising in 2015, a new police unit came into prominence. It was called the Gun Trace Task Force. It was led by a former Marine, and it operated much like special forces operate in counter-guerrilla campaigns. Special forces military operations are not trying to build a case that's going to hold up in court. They are just trying to, defeat an insurgency. Well, so the Gun Trace Task Force worked very much the same. It would roam the city, basically hunting black people on the suspicion that they might have drugs, guns, or money. They would jump out of their cars, hassle people walking down the street without probable cause, which is something you're supposed to need under the Constitution of the United States. They broke down doors. They would search houses without warrants. And of course, the searches would never hold up in court, but they didn't need them to, because they acted as if they were trying to break a sort of underground resistance movement or revolutionary movement, but that movement unfortunately didn't actually exist. And they started to eventually rob people, brutalize people, torture them, and even kill people who got in their way. And this is, again, something that we see frequently happening in counter-guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency operations. Now, the GTTF was eventually shut down. The members all went to prison. But not before they went to prison. They were all commended as being the best and most effective police that Baltimore had ever seen. After they all went to prison, the GTTF was disbanded, but almost immediately a new force was instituted called the District Action Team, and we've just been learning about this now through some really amazing journalism in the city. And it's basically doing the exact same thing. And it's some of the leaders of these district action teams are veterans of the war in Afghanistan, and you can find that out by just looking at their LinkedIn. So to summarize, whether we look at police from the lens of operations, from the lens of technology, or from the lens of personnel, Whether we look at history, whether we look at what's happening last week, we can find numerous crucial constitutive connections between police and military, between empire overseas and law enforcement at home. And I think that this demands that we link up our movements, join our hands in struggle to abolish all forms of state violence, whether they're overseas or domestic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanice and Stuart. So yes to everything they've already said. I can just pass on the mic. I wanted to start by thanking Jenna, Sherry, Heba, and Malta for putting this event together. We first started putting this event together back in September. When we were supposed to hold it in term 2, we were on strike, so of course we canceled it. And now it's been moved to this time, and now we're on a marking boycott. So we're kind of following our industrial action with this event, and I'm very glad that we're finally all here together and it's organized as a conversation. My colleague Raya was supposed to be here. She's another amazing Palestinian activist, but she couldn't make it. She's way cooler and more hip than I am, but she couldn't make it today, so I'm filling in. So I'm coming at this question slightly differently from a different geography. And when we first started talking about this event, one of the things we wanted to do was speak about carcerality and abolition more internationally. Because quite often the conversation tends to be extremely US-centric. Sometimes people will enter the UK or France into the conversation. Every now and then Israel will be referred to, or Australia, but not seriously taking the international dimension of what carcerality means. So let me start by saying that for me, the way I think of carcerality goes beyond just prisons or policing. It is an act embedded within the logic of how modern day capitalism is actually structured. It's about the warehousing of people in cages. It's about stopping movement. It's about an international apartheid system that continuously works through rating people and naming who is a surplus population and who is not. So as somebody who is Palestinian, for example, carcerality has structured my entire life. You are born into a refugee camp that you cannot leave. You are tagged as somebody with an ID or not an ID that can cross a checkpoint or can't cross a checkpoint. More recently, there's an apartheid wall that gets to decide whether you go to school or not. All those are forms of carcerality. So it's not simply the imprisonment or policing, it's much more that bigger logic for me around how carcerality functions. And I think it allows us to think in a couple of ways about where this system is rooted. So one thing is the colonial roots of the ideas of imprisonment, carcerality, and policing. And I would highly recommend that everybody reads Adam's work for this, because it really roots carcerality and this logic in the longer histories of colonialism. In the Palestinian case specifically, many of the laws that are used today by Israel against Palestinians were actually rooted in British colonization. So administrative detention, for example, which is being able to hold someone without them seeing any evidence against them, was actually under British law, under British occupation, under British colonialism. And Israel just inherited that and has continued to use it. Today, there are 1,083 administrative detainees in Israeli prisons. These are Palestinians that have no idea what the evidence against them is, and their detention can be renewed indefinitely. It is for 6 months, but then most of the time, on the final day of the 6 months, it will be renewed for another 6 months, and it is renewed indefinitely. So I think thinking of this logic of carcerality more internationally allows us to look at these colonial links and colonial roots. I know there has been a much more recent scholarship around the boomerang effect, starting with the war on terror. I think there's much more longer-term legacies and archives of colonialism that we need to trace when we are thinking. And again, I think Adam has done a fantastic job in his writing around tracing those roots. The other way I think of carcerality is to ensure that we are embedding it in the logic of how capitalism operates. And the other hat I wear is somebody who studies logistics. And logistics is all about free movement of products. It's all about business people organizing the production line and the production service for containers to fly around the world as freely as they can. The opposite of that logic is to ensure that there is containment and warehousing of people who are unwanted. And I think we constantly, this mic is driving me crazy. And I think we need to think of this dual logic all the time and present this dual logic that, you know, some things are supposed to move. Capital is supposed to move as quickly as possible, while there are specific bodies that are raced, classed, and gendered in particular ways that are not allowed to move. Which leads us to the question of our movements connecting together. Again, quite often we reduce the conversation about abolition to just the prison system or to just policing, which doesn't allow us to see the broader international ramifications, but also the differences in the bodies that are contained. And I don't use raced, classed, and gendered because I think these categories are separate or stand on their own. Of course, they are co-constitutive, but we need to pay particular attention to which bodies and how, especially in a moment of extreme transphobia in this particular country that is just absurd and has gone completely just in such a harmful, demeaning, violent way. I think we do need to speak up and consider those differences and how they operate at that level. So for me, those are the two important ways of thinking around carcerality: is ensuring the colonial roots are always there, that we are examining them, that we're not just containing ourselves to the operations of the police in one country, but that we are always thinking about it in the logic of how capitalism operates in that duality. Some things should move, but other things should not. And I just had two issues, concerns, questions I have just for the rest of us to discuss that I think are quite important in the way the Black Lives Matter moment played out in this country in particular, because there was a lot of performativity around people taking the knee, corporations saying whatever they were saying, putting out statements about how they're all suddenly anti-racist, but never really discussing that question of policing. And those same politicians that took the knee, I'm not going to name names because they don't deserve to be named, come back with extreme proposals for policing on what they term antisocial behavior. Now, this does happen currently, but it also happened in the Corbyn moment where everybody was like, yay, this is the most left it's ever going to be. If you take a look at that manifesto around policing, it's also quite like, let's fund the police, let's get more policing in the communities. And everybody decided to kind of close the chapter on that page and just read in between the things about industrialization and trains. I encourage everyone to read that page because I think we need to have a much more serious conversation around policing in this country, particularly its colonial roots, but also its current manifestations that I think is really important. And I'd be very happy to have it with everyone here because we're all working in these movements and we're trying to bring these conversations to the forefront and often feeling frustrated like we're all on our own. So it would be good to bring that together. The other question, again, comes to me from the Palestinian context, where, of course, there has been a lot more conversation about abolition, around the role of prisons, for basically warehousing unwanted people, for basically warehousing people who are impoverished, working class people, as has already been said. But there's also a deep attachment to the term political prisoners, because people feel that they have been imprisoned for taking political action. And I think sometimes we miss this out in the conversations around abolition, and I wonder how we can have that conversation. I think it's an important one to have, to bring in a lot of the analysis, but also the refusal action that political movements have taken for decades. So the subject we're speaking about today is refusing carcerality. If you think about political prisoners, whether Kurdish political prisoners, Iranian political prisoners, in today's Sisi regime, Egyptian political prisoners, the history of Palestinian struggles really leads us to think about how prisoners themselves have refused in various ways, how they've organized in various ways, how they set up universities under very difficult circumstances. So I don't think we should give up on that long legacy of refusing carcerality by political movements internationally, and there's a lot there to learn from that moment. I'll leave it there for now. I wanted to just open up some questions that we can all take up collectively. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, first up, massive thank you to everyone at GPU for putting this together and for the invitation. Special thanks to Rafif for making me feel really English and awkward by being nice about my book. But as we're here, you know, quick plug, the book is available on your favourite BitTorrent website for £0 and 0 pence, so get onto LibGen and anyway. So yeah, they're all on BitTorrent, it's great. So I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have maybe been touched upon already. And one of them is this kind of Corbyn thing, right? And the reason I think the Corbyn thing is interesting is because, of course, okay, so the Corbyn project is like, cops, we need more cops because, you know, the terrible Tories cut them with austerity. But you know what's really bad? War. We really hate war, but we like cops. We hate war, we like cops. It's like, okay, so there's something happening here, right? And so now I started to think about, you know, you go to these big anti-war marches and there's loads of people there, you know, it's old, you know, biddies with their grandkids and it's, you know, it's all multi-generational and lovely. And Jamie Corbyn gets up and he makes a really rousing speech, right? It's kind of one of the great things about Jamie Corbyn is he can make this really relatable, almost commonsensical set of arguments, right? That really reaches people. And when I thought about them and I started to break down these arguments against the occupation of Afghanistan or the bombing of Libya or the invasion of Iraq or wherever it might be, they're kind of similar to the kinds of arguments that we might make against police and prisons in places like Britain or any other kind of domestic context, right? So I've got a few of them. So the most common one, of course, right, that we often hear is that these people need saving, right? We're going to invade Iraq because these people need saving, right? And of course, everyone at the anti-war march cheers when Jeremy Corbyn says, and you know, these promises are hollow, right? These people don't need saving with bombs and with guns and with soldiers, right? You know, if they're living in poverty, they need jobs and infrastructure, right? If they need access to resources, they should be schools and hospitals. If they need, if they have problems with, I don't know, the economy, right? There should be investment in green energy and infrastructure and all of these types of things, right? But these are precisely the kinds of arguments we have been making and people are making in relation to our critique of the police and prison system, right? The people, you know, we hear newspapers and media outlets and politicians say, you know, these people in these working class areas, in these black communities, in these Muslim communities, they need saving from the terrorists and the gangsters and the knife wielders and the gypsy Roma travellers and the whatever it might be, right? But of course we know, no, that's what they need if they want safely are jobs and education and all the forms of social health and infrastructure that is necessary. Of course, the other big argument, right, is that's often made in favour of war is that, you know, there are brutal dictators, there's violence in these parts of the world, so of course we're going to solve that violence with more violence, right? With our military, with our bombs, right? And of course we know Jeremy Corbyn can get up on stage and tell us what an absurd argument to make, right? But of course this is the precise argument that is made in relation to public safety in the domestic context, right? There is a problem with safety and harm and violence in a particular community, so we're going to bring these armed officers with their tasers, with their spit hoods, with their police dogs, with all of their violence tools to come and get rid of the violence. Of course, the other thing we're often told, which Jeremy Corbyn tells us is an absurdity, as we all agree, and we all nod along quite enthusiastically, is that war brings democracy, right? And of course, again, we know that this isn't true. We know that these violent institutions do not bring about democracy. And what we really need in our communities is real forms of direct democracy, community-led forms of social and cultural and community infrastructure, right? This is what we need in order to provide a tangible and real and effective form of democracy, not institutions of violence, whether they be the military on the global scale or the police in the domestic. And of course, finally, the critics of war often tell us that these wars are simply a political distraction. Capitalism is in crisis and they can't solve that crisis. They can't give us the jobs and the wages we need to keep our heads above water. They can't provide older people with the pensions they require. They can't provide the forms of social and healthcare that people need if they're not able to perform wage labour. They can't do any of those kinds of things because capitalism is in crisis. So what they need is a good war of distraction. They need to bomb Libya. They need to occupy Afghanistan. They need to invade Iraq. They need to have they need to have the new bogeyman of wherever it might be in the global south or Russia or wherever, in order to distract people. And of course, in a very comparable way, we see similar forms of distraction taking place, of course, here, right? I don't have to tell you that the spectre of the migrant or the gypsy Roma traveller or the terrorist or the gangster or whoever it might be is a very useful, not simply political distraction, but of course a form of nationalist moral panic, right, which can help people to feel a sense of belonging and purpose in a economic and political and social system in which crises abound, solutions are few and far between, and people's purpose in a dwindling former empire often feels without any anchor. And so I think thinking about how we can utilize these kinds of anti-war arguments and connect it to the very similar and overlapping arguments against police and prison expansion is one way we can hopefully begin to expand these conversations in which we're trying to resist and challenge and move against this expansion of carcerality, and bring in people who, in many ways, these anti-military arguments make lots and lots of sense, and try to encourage them to think about the importance of applying comparable kinds of logic to the kinds of state violence that take place on their doorsteps.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to, is that on? Can you hear me? I just want to thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to both hear the other great interventions and bring together some issues I've been thinking about as someone who works or has worked in criminology, as well as on far-right extremism and terrorism, well, state responses to them in relation to carcerality and abolition. So carcerality also extends beyond what are typically seen as carceral institutions, policies, practices, and punishments. But I just want to kind of return it to the prison and the literal for a moment to discuss, to expand it out again, but to discuss how alternatives to the carceral are constructed and played off one another in the context of counterterrorism and counter-extremism, as well as in wider criminology, teaching, and practice, in ways that distract from and ultimately serve an unequal and unjust system. Now, right-wing rallying cries of more police and harsher sentences are things we're all familiar with, as well as accusations that academic theories just provide excuses. They're familiar to many, as are system-supportive, liberal, reformist variations. Yet with counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, in addition to more laws and law enforcement or security, we've also seen alternatives to incarceration and demand for more academic theories, ironically. Yet far from being positive and progressive, it is represented by highly problematic problem-solving securitization, de-radicalization, disengagement, and wider prevention responses, such as Prevent in the UK or the National Strategy in the US. In fact, far from a solution to the problem, prison is often seen within the context of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism as a site of potential radicalization, a bad thing and a bad place. Except it's a good place if you want to interview extremists and terrorists so you can feed your de-radicalization theories. While carceral approaches in criminal justice and criminology are part of a wider menu or repertoire of responses and solutions, in counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, they are dominant and often positioned in comparison to worse or more illiberal alternative state responses, such as criminalization and incarceration. So prevent and things like this, the de-radicalization approaches, are seen as and positioned as better, so they're better alternatives to locking people up. Now, criticism of these policies and practices is often responded to with, and I get this all the time in my work, what would you do? How would you solve extremism and terrorism? This often comes from problem-solving think tanks, centers, etc., who have decided they're the front line of this problem, and thus everyone else is in the back. And then the other question you get is, well, do you want more extremism and terrorism? Which often the answer they expect is you to say, no. And then you end up having to sort of get wrapped into their problem-solving repertoire. You get the same thing with racism, particularly because in far-right studies, those working on preventing the far right see themselves as the front line of fighting racism. And I think this is part of a longer conversation because particularly in the post sort of George Floyd BLM moment, when systemic racism as a term became familiar to many people who had never thought of it beyond bad ideas and opinions, decided that this is the way you fight racism, by fighting the far right. So the answer you get is, well, do you want more racism? Which is an odd thing for a field that has never, ever, barely even uses the word white for white supremacist movements. Anyway, it's a longer conversation. But many of us, including myself, were recently online, have been called an armchair critic, or quarterback, which is what the Americans call you, and are dismissed because we are not on the ground, or in Whitehall, or the White House, and fighting the good fight as part of the solution, particularly to racism and fascism, which is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. I'm always seem to be kind of accused of diminishing the Holocaust or diminishing fascism, because you don't think the be and end all is fighting 7 white supremacists hanging around a statue, as opposed to the statue itself being a problem. And because next to fascism and the far right, systemic racism and racial inequality and injustice are invisibilized. And in opposition to those calling for the defunding and abolition of the same agencies. So basically, you're an armchair critic, and it's a weird construct within extremism, terrorism, and far-right studies, because actually those, and we see this particularly in, the construct of sort of you're the academic versus the activist, or there can be academic activists. Well, you have a parallel, a very problematic parallel to this, and I say parallel not because they're similar, but because it's another kind of opposition that's constructed between the active security official and the armchair critic who just sits back and lets someone else do the good work on the ground. And so the way in which they construct abolition and defunding is as the worst case of doing nothing, as opposed to activist. And there's not to say that criminalization and carceral approaches are unconnected and not utilized, and not just as a straw argument or sentence for an actual attack, but at or across borders. That is, the detention and deportation used against foreign nationals or with conditional contingent status due to their parental citizenship, country of birth, type of visa, or who can be linked to foreign movements or other racist policies that overlap and feed far-right and state anti-immigration policies and narratives. This not only makes the distinction between the domestic and foreign actors, but extremism and terrorism, in how they are approached, at least distinct for the former and collapse for the latter. This also attests to the ways in which racism, Islamophobia, and colonial history feed into carcerality and wider criminal justice, as well as counterterrorism and counter-extremism. And we see this with the sort of the Shamima Begum case. Until recently in the US, there was actually no law against domestic terrorism, reading white and far right. In recent years, particularly in the post-George Floyd period and post-6th of January insurrection, we see calls for more criminal justice responses to the far right and hate crimes, as well as calls for labeling and targeting far-right white terrorism. And we see this not just from conservatives and liberals and opportunistic counterterrorism and counter-extremism types, but from anti-racists and critics of Prevent, which I find is quite problematic. This is done to highlight or attempt to address the racist double standard evident in the application of the label and policies, as well as their implications for Muslims in particular, as well as combat racism and fascism that we all oppose. Don't we want the state to take greater action against white supremacists and violent racists? Now, I support the intention, it's the thought that counts, but these are very misguided. Because one, there's a long history of states exceptionalizing and displacing racism from the system onto right-wing extremism. And two, it is always going to legitimize and expand the security state and criminal justice system, offset criticism, and that's really important, and not actually address racism, particularly institutional racism in these very state institutions and agencies. In the case of Prevent, we see an increase in far-right referrals, but it's quickly followed by two things. One is a politics or construction of equivalence, all types of extremism. We see this with national security. It reacts to January 6th and Trumpism, where you have a sort of a democratically elected government as an exception to the body politic, which is quite ironic and weird. But the other thing you see with this construction of equivalence is you say, well, these are all the same. They're all extremists. You see these new what I call colorblind concepts, such as polarization, mutual extremism, or cumulative extremism, and what is it? Ideologically motivated violent extremism. And you often see they say, yeah, of course, we want to get the white supremacists, but then they go, but it's the anarchists also, and the Islamists, and, an ethnically motivated violent extremism, which is the major threat, and it is white supremacists, is then travels over to Black Lives Matter and what are called black identity extremists. And we see this flattening out of power and representation, particularly when all the communities that would be affected by all of these approaches would not have the same level of representation within the state agencies and the government that enforces them and funds them, crucially. And the second thing is, you also then see the backlash, like the Shawcross review that says, the problem here we've got is that this disproportionately focuses on the far right, which distracts us from the real problem, which is Islamists. And here's a big problem. We can't tell the difference between extreme and mainstream forms of far-right ideas, which I would say is absolutely true. Shawcross is dead right about that. But that's a problem. It's not a problem for Prevent to overcome. That's a problem with the concept of extremism, and it's a problem with this country. And just to sort of wrap it up, that they're part of the reason that we have a problem with this distinction is because we live in a period where, despite all the talk of terror extremism and even the scapegoating of the far right, and I say scapegoating not because they're not horrible, terrible, but because they're scapegoat for all the racism that exists in society. We live in a context where for the past decade, we have simultaneously been exceptionalizing racism and keep on dropping that, and mainstreaming the far right, in the sense that we've constructed this idea of the left behind, where ideas of vulnerability and inequality only matter if they're white people and they could turn to violent extremism. But if we can get their vote, we can prevent the violence, we can prevent the extremism, and we no longer have to call it extremism. We no longer have to worry about terrorism, except for the other people who they also target and the state targets. And you get caught in a loop where it reveals the inequality of power, but also the sort of the fallacy and farce that is the concept of extremism. And I say that by way of highlighting the fact that we have to be very careful when we talk about carcerality and alternatives to it, because these are, and I think we all know this, we all know that these alternatives are designed to offset and to expand the security state and offset criticism. And I think on an absolute final note, sorry, there is a connection between the so-called left behind, the far-right racism, and the prison system, as well as jobs. And I think I say this also as a criminologist who, for years, has had to deal with at University of East London, where the students, many of my students, face institutional racism. The jobs that are on offer for criminologists, if you think the police are institutionally racist, the progressive jobs that are on offer are in prison, in probation. It's working with people. And this is one of those alternatives that's a setup. It's a setup that still increases the carceral state. And I think on the final note, sorry, do I do that?
Yeah.
Is that...
Final.
Yeah. Going back to the border, the idea of the left behind, those white working class people that have no jobs and are having their jobs stolen, were given jobs. They were given jobs at the border in the private prison sector that was designed to give them their racism and give them their jobs at the cost of other people.
No.
And I'll just end it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're going to conclude there, but we can continue this discussion in the reception area. There's drinks and nibbles. But I just want to once again say thank you to all of you for attending and for our panelists. And finally, just want to recognize those who have supported tonight's event. Queen Mary University of London, specifically the School of Politics and International Relations, the British International Studies Association, BISA, as well as the School of Politics and Economics here at King's College London. And just a final round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.